It's July 23rd on the calendar. The third round of direct negotiations between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations has concluded in Istanbul. And as expected, there was no major breakthrough after these talks, except for an agreement on new exchanges of prisoners of war and the bodies of fallen Ukrainian heroes and Russian occupiers. But now it seems that we are once again sliding back to the Minsk format, only this time under a new guise. At the very least, the Russian side is proposing to create 1 million different working groups that will continue negotiations online and gradually prepare for an alleged meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. Ukraine, in turn, insists on a complete and unconditional ceasefire along the entire front line. The Russians are proposing short-term truces in order to collect the bodies of the dead and stabilize the situation in certain areas of the front. In addition, the Russian side stated that today they discussed so-called memorandums on how each side envisions the end of the war. But the positions are still too far apart, so all these discussions will continue. The Ukrainian side stated that it is ready to hold a meeting between the leaders Zelensky and Putin with the participation of Erdogan and Donald Trump by the end of August. The Russians are effectively refusing such a meeting, saying that it is still too early. Moreover, the Ukrainian side says, look, Donald Trump, we support all your initiatives. There have already been many different meetings, direct negotiations with the Russians, but as you can see, there are still no significant results. So let's discuss together the results of the third round of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul. Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel. The link to it is in the description of this video. So let's go through everything step by step. Now let me remind you that today in Istanbul, the third round of direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia took place. And so Turkey, as the host country, opened these negotiations. And Hakan Fidan, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey, while opening this session, stated that Turkey is ready to help monitor the ceasefire in Ukraine. The country has the necessary infrastructure for this, and so he called on Ukraine and Russia to finally reach an agreement on a ceasefire. According to him, Turkey can also facilitate prisoner exchanges based on a more structured methodology. Quote, on the occasion of the Istanbul talks, we have the opportunity to show that diplomacy and dialogue are more effective in achieving peace than confrontation and weapons. We have the necessary infrastructure in the context of a monitoring mechanism in case a ceasefire agreement is reached. Rustem Umerov, head of the Ukrainian delegation and current secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, has already made statements. And on the other side, Medinsky. Let me remind you, recently Putin promoted him to the status of the Kremlin's chief ideologist. Let's begin with the Ukrainian statements, then analyze the Russian ones. So, Umerov stated that more than 1,200 people will take part in the humanitarian exchange between Ukraine and Russia. When it will take place has not yet been announced, but it has been reported that both sides agreed that the Russians consented to the return of people who have been in captivity for more than 3 years, including those who are seriously wounded and young people. Ukraine and Russia also agreed to exchange both military personnel and civilians. This is already being stated by Russian propagandists. Let's return to the position of the Ukrainian delegation. The statement goes as follows. The work on the humanitarian track will continue. We insist on an unconditional ceasefire. Our priorities are a meeting of the leaders and the humanitarian track. What do the Russians say about this? Well, the Russians do not want a complete ceasefire. And as Medinsky said today, quote, we once again propose to the Ukrainian side to consider the issue of declaring short truces on the front line in order to collect the wounded and gather the bodies of their soldiers. So basically, the Russians just need short breaks, but they are absolutely not willing to agree to a complete ceasefire. In addition, Umerov stated that Trump's initiative is supported by the Ukrainian side. There have already been many different meetings with the Russians. There are achievements on the humanitarian track, but when it comes to a truce or a ceasefire, there are no concessions from the Russian side. In addition, as Umerov stated, the Ukrainian side is always ready for a ceasefire, but Russia does not want this. Ukraine has proposed to hold a meeting of leaders with the participation of Erdogan and Trump before the end of August. And here is an important point, because indeed, according to Umarov, Ukraine proposed to hold a meeting between Zelensky and Putin before the end of August. And then his quote, "Such a meeting is capable of unlocking real political progress. Russia must demonstrate its readiness for this, but the Russians are not ready for it." Medinsky states the meeting between the leaders of Ukraine and the Russian Federation should put an end to it. For such a meeting, it is necessary to work out the terms of the agreements and understand what will be discussed at this meeting. Well, basically, it's clear what to discuss, but the Russians keep dodging. Putin, of course, is afraid to leave his bunker and go to negotiations, just like it was in May. In mid-May, Putin himself called for negotiations with Zelensky, but didn't show up in Istanbul, sending Medinsky in his place. In addition, according to Umarov, the meeting was different from the previous ones. There were already fewer emotions, fewer threats from the Russians. In addition, Zelensky's offer to meet with Putin remains valid indefinitely. As soon as Putin changes his diapers and comes out of the bunker, Zelensky is ready to meet with him at any moment. In addition, regarding the so-called memorandums, let me remind you that the Russian side stated before the negotiations that the issues of the memorandums would be discussed at these talks. That is, the perspectives on how both sides see the end of the war. In other words, what it should look like. And so Medinsky stated, and I quote, "We discussed the memorandums. The positions of Ukraine and Russia are quite far apart. We agreed to continue contacts." However, Umarov stated, "The documents discussed at the negotiations are not correctly called memorandums. We consider them drafts." It's important to note that the Ukrainian documents are more realistic than the Russian ones. And it's also known that right at the moments when Umarov and Medinsky were speaking, after the negotiations in Istanbul ended, a prisoner exchange of 250 for 250 was completed on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. Reportedly, this is the 9th stage of the prisoner exchange, the agreements for which were reached in Istanbul. Notably, critically ill and gravely injured Ukrainian defenders have come back home. Over all the stages of the recent Istanbul agreements, more than 1,000 of our people have been returned. This was already a statement by Volodymyr Zelensky. And here I would also like to quote the Ukrainian ombudsman Lubenets, who says that 3 defenders who returned today from Russian captivity will celebrate their birthdays tomorrow on their native land. The oldest released prisoner is 66 years old and the youngest is 27 years old. Several soldiers were considered missing in action, but today they have returned to the sacred Ukrainian land. In addition, the last defender of Zmini Island, who had remained in Russian captivity until now, has also returned home from captivity. Now let's discuss the most noteworthy moment, Medinsky. This is something worth paying attention to. Medinsky stated today that the Russian side proposed to form 3 working groups that will work online on political, humanitarian and military issues. It would seem that there is some constructiveness in this proposal, that there really are several working groups that will process different issues online, and then later gather in Istanbul and discuss something in detail. But there is a very dangerous trap in this. Let me explain why. Remember the so-called Minsk format, those very Minsk agreements. So, in this Minsk format, there were a whole bunch of working groups. These working groups worked online, met in person, met in Minsk, and discussed things. And in the end, this whole process dragged on for months and years and led to nothing. As soon as they start breaking things down into working groups, it means the process will be dragged out as much as possible. The Ukrainian delegation has repeatedly said, listen, let's organize a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, fine, with Erdogan and Trump as mediators, and then we can have a proper substantive discussion there. Everything is on the surface. Everything is on the surface. But the Russians, just to drag out the process, say let's create a bunch of working groups, then there will be sub-working groups and then sub-subgroups. All of this will just be a drag, long coordination processes and so on. This really reminds me of the Minsk format, only now they'll probably call it the Istanbul format, and we risk getting bogged down in this process. And then 50 days will pass, the ones Trump gave to Putin. The Russians will say, listen, you see the process is ongoing, there are a lot of working groups, we're working, something is being developed, and so on. So, give us a little more time. This is the situation we must not get into. There are clear negotiation groups from both sides, they meet, they discuss. No working subgroups are needed. Again, as soon as things are split into subgroups, that's it. This is the process maximum delay. Russian media are spreading rumors about a meeting between the heads of the Ukrainian and Russian delegations, Rustem Umerov and Vladimir Medinsky, in Istanbul. Reportedly, they held a secret one-on-one meeting after the main negotiations to discuss something. This is fake because sources are now reporting that in reality, no such meeting took place. Russian propagandists, citing some of their own sources, spread information that Umerov and Medinsky were supposedly holding a bilateral meeting at the Saragan Palace in Istanbul. But those Ukrainian sources say that there was no one-on-one meeting between Umerov and Medinsky. As before, there was a brief preparatory meeting with 3 attendees. That's Umerov, Yafedan, and Medinsky, the delegation heads, plus the hosts. There were no bilateral negotiations between Umerov and Medinsky. The Russians are interested in spinning the story that Umerov is secretly meeting Medinsky in person to discuss something. Again, this is an information ploy to make Ukrainian society start having doubts, like maybe Umerov is actually making some deals with the Russians behind our backs. So these are basically the non-results of these negotiations. I'll leave it at that. There's really nothing more to analyze here. I think it will also be interesting to see Donald Trump's reaction. I think he'll make a statement later and respond to this 3rd round, but for now, these are the non-results. So basically, everything came down to humanitarian issues, nothing more. So I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone. Subtitles created by